The sound cuts through the silence like a knife. A ceramic plate spitting across an empty kitchen floor, then shattering against the far wall. No hands touched it. No earthquake shook the foundation. The witnesses stand frozen, their rational minds struggling to process what their eyes just saw. Then another crash. A glass tumbler launches itself from the counter, arcing through the air with impossible velocity. Then another, and another. The room erupts into chaos as objects take flight, each movement defying every law of physics we've spent centuries proving. This is not a ghost story. This is documented reality. What you're about to witness isn't folklore whispered around campfires, or tales spun by attention seekers. These are cases investigated by scientists, recorded by skeptics, and experienced by ordinary people whose lives were torn apart by an intelligence that shouldn't exist. An intelligence that doesn't just haunt. It attacks. It escalates. It feeds on the terror it creates. The question we must confront is simple, yet its implications are profound. What happens when your home, your sanctuary, becomes infected with something that rewrites the rules of reality itself? When doors slam with the force of explosions, though no wind blows. When fires ignite spontaneously on walls, floors, ceilings, burning in patterns that make no sense. When voices emerge from recording devices, speaking words that no living person uttered, answering questions that weren't yet asked. This phenomenon has a name. Poltergeist. The Germans gave it to us. Noisy ghost. But that name, comforting in its simplicity, barely scratches the surface of what these cases reveal. Because ghosts, as we traditionally understand them, are passive, residual, echoes of the past playing on an endless loop. What we're examining is anything but passive. It's aggressive, it's intelligent, and most disturbing of all, it appears to be escalating. From suburban homes in Connecticut to council estates in London, from Japanese apartments to Brazilian farmhouses, the pattern repeats itself with terrifying consistency. It begins small. Knocking sounds. Objects moved from where they were placed. Easy to dismiss. Easy to rationalize. But then it grows. It learns. It becomes bolder. Heavier objects begin to move. Beds shake violently with people in them. Unseen hands grab, scratch, push. Witnesses report feeling watched by something that radiates malevolence. Something that seems to delight in their fear. We're going to walk through these cases together, examining the evidence that investigators couldn't explain away, the testimony that skeptics couldn't debunk, and the physical proof that remains unexplained decades later. We're going to trace the patterns that connect these incidents across time and space, searching for answers to questions that challenge everything we think we know about consciousness, energy, and the nature of reality itself. This is not entertainment. This is investigation. And what we uncover may change how you see the walls around you forever. The telephone hung suspended in midair, frozen in that impossible moment between the table and the floor. The photographer's shutter had caught it there, a black rotary phone floating in the living room of a modest house on Blue Ash Road in Columbus, Ohio. In the frame, 14-year-old Tina Resch sat on the couch, her hands clearly visible, nowhere near the object. The date was March 14, 1984, and the single photograph would become one of the most analyzed, debated, and controversial pieces of evidence in the history of paranormal investigation. But the photograph told only a fraction of the story. It captured one heartbeat, one frozen instant in what had become a nightmare that consumed the Resch household for weeks. What the image could not convey was the sound of the impact when objects struck walls, the family's exhaustion from sleepless nights, or the growing sense that something inexplicable and increasingly violent had taken hold in their home. The reporters and photographers who documented the case would leave shaken, their notebooks filled with observations that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of physics they had learned in school. The disturbances had begun simply enough, the way these cases almost always do. Small things at first, objects misplaced, items found where no one had put them. John and Joan Resch initially thought nothing of it. They had fostered Tina since she was 11 months old, eventually adopting her alongside several other children. Teenage forgetfulness seemed a reasonable explanation, but by early March of 1984, The incidents had escalated beyond anything that could be dismissed as absent-mindedness or teenage prank. Joan Resch was alone with Tina in the house when she first witnessed something that defied rational explanation. A set of kitchen knives lifted from the counter and clattered to the floor. Not fell. Lifted. Joan watched them rise into the air before dropping. She stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what her eyes had just shown her. Minutes later, a glass flew from the cupboard and shattered against the opposite wall. Then, another. Tina sat at the kitchen table, her homework spread before her, seemingly as startled as her mother. The activity intensified with each passing day. Light bulbs exploded in their sockets, showering glass across rooms. Pictures swung violently on walls before tearing free and crashing to the floor. Chairs scraped across linoleum floors with no one near them. The family began keeping a log, documenting each incident. By the time they reached out to local reporters, they had recorded dozens of unexplainable events. They were desperate for answers, for someone to tell them what was happening in their home and how to make it stop. Mike Hardin, a reporter and photographer for the Columbus Dispatch, arrived at the Resch home on March 8, 1984, expecting to find a family mistaken or, perhaps, perpetrating a hoax. He was a professional skeptic by training, someone who dealt in facts and evidence. What he witnessed over the next several hours would challenge everything he thought he knew about the nature of reality. Hardin set up his camera in the living room, positioning himself to capture the family's daily routine. He had been there less than an hour when a table lamp suddenly flew across the room. He had been watching Tina. Her hands were visible. She was not touching the lamp. Before he could fully process what had happened, a set of candlesticks launched themselves from a shelf. Then the telephone, that famous telephone, lifted from its cradle and sailed through the air. His finger pressed the shutter by instinct, capturing the moment that would define the case. The resulting photograph appeared on the front page of the Columbus Dispatch on March 22, 1984. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The image spread across news wires, appearing in newspapers across the country, and eventually around the world. Television crews descended on the Resch household. The family, who had simply wanted help understanding what was happening to them, found themselves at the center of a media circus. But Hardin was not the only witness. Other reporters and photographers documented similar events. Fred Shannon, another photographer, captured images of chairs appearing to move on their own. A television crew from a local news station filmed lamps swaying violently before crashing to the floor. These were not credulous believers in the supernatural. These were trained journalists, people whose careers depended on skeptical observation and accurate reporting. Yet their notes and footage described the same impossible phenomena. The incidents followed a disturbing pattern, one that researchers would later identify as characteristic of what they termed recurrent, spontaneous psychokinesis. The activity occurred almost exclusively when Tina was present. When she left the house, the phenomena ceased. When she returned, they resumed. The objects seemed to fly in her direction or away from her. She was, whether she wanted to be or not, the epicenter of the chaos, and the chaos was escalating. What had begun with objects shifting position had progressed to items flying through the air. Now, the activity was becoming violent, even dangerous. A clock struck Tina in the head, leaving a visible bruise. Glasses shattered inches from family members. Heavy furniture toppled without warning. The family began to fear for their safety in their own home. One night, Tina was physically thrown from her bed. Joan Resch heard her daughter scream and rushed to the bedroom to find Tina on the floor, tangled in her sheets. The bed frame had shifted several feet from its original position. Tina was crying, terrified, insisting she had been lifted and hurled from the mattress by an unseen force. The incident left visible marks on her arms, where she claimed invisible hands had gripped her. Parapsychologists arrived to investigate, bringing with them instruments to measure electromagnetic fields, temperature variations, and other environmental factors. Dr. William Roll, a respected researcher from the Psychical Research Foundation in North Carolina, spent extensive time in the Resch home. He documented the phenomena with scientific rigor, noting the timing, location, and nature of each incident. He interviewed family members separately, looking for inconsistencies in their stories. He found none. Roll had investigated dozens of similar cases over his career. He recognized the pattern. A young person, almost always an adolescent, at the center of unexplainable physical phenomena. Objects moving, appearing to defy gravity. The activity escalating over weeks or months before eventually subsiding. He had developed a theory, one that remained controversial even within the small community of parapsychologists. He called it recurrent, spontaneous psychokinesis, the unconscious ability of certain individuals to affect physical objects through mental energy they could neither control nor understand. But Roll also recognized something else in the Resch case, something that troubled him deeply. Tina was not a happy teenager. She had been adopted, but she struggled with feelings of abandonment related to her birth family. She clashed frequently with her parents, particularly with her father. She was angry, confused, grappling with the typical storms of adolescence, amplified by the unique challenges of her situation. In nearly every case of alleged psychokinesis Roll had studied, the young person at the center was experiencing significant emotional distress. The skeptics mobilized quickly. Magician and paranormal debunker James Randi analyzed the famous photograph and declared it could easily be fake. Tina could have thrown the phone and returned her hands to a neutral position before the shutter closed. The photographer might have been in on the deception. Other skeptics pointed out that none of the phenomena had been captured under controlled laboratory condition. Everything happened in the chaotic environment of the family home, where trickery would be easier to accomplish. Some investigators claimed to have caught Tina in acts of deception. During one session, an observer reported seeing her surreptitiously knock items from a table when she thought no one was watching. These revelations were seized upon by skeptics as proof that the entire case was an elaborate hoax, a troubled teenager seeking attention through increasingly elaborate pranks. But this explanation left questions unanswered. The sheer number of incidents seemed difficult for one teenager to orchestrate alone. The family had nothing to gain from the media attention, which had made their lives significantly more stressful. Multiple professional journalists and researchers, people trained to spot deception, had witnessed events they could not explain through normal means. If it was all trickery, it was remarkably sophisticated trickery for a 14-year-old girl. The Resch case highlighted a frustrating reality that has plagued paranormal research for decades. The phenomena, if genuine, seemed to resist systematic study. They occurred spontaneously, unpredictably, in ways that made controlled scientific observation nearly impossible. The presence of observers and recording equipment sometimes seemed to suppress the activity entirely. And the cases almost always involved human witnesses, whose testimony, no matter how credible, could be dismissed by determined skeptics. By summer of 1984, the activity in the Resch household had largely subsided. The flying objects, the exploding lights, the furniture moving on its own, all of it gradually decreased in frequency and intensity before stopping altogether. This too was characteristic of the pattern Roll had observed in other cases. The phenomena burned hot and fast before burning out, typically lasting weeks to a few months. But the case had taken a severe toll on the family. The media attention had been relentless and often cruel. Tina struggled with the labels attached to her, whether as a troubled faker seeking attention or as someone genuinely afflicted by forces beyond her control. The family relationships, already strained, deteriorated further under the pressure. Years later, Tina's life would take dark turns, tragedy and trouble following her long after the poltergeist activity had ceased. The photograph remains, that impossible image of a telephone suspended in air. It sits in archives now, alongside the reports and witness statements, and endless debates about what really happened in that house on Blue Ash Road. For believers, it represents tangible proof of phenomena science has yet to acknowledge or explain. For skeptics, it is either evidence of elaborate deception or a misleading image captured through timing and chance. But perhaps the most important element of the Tina Resch case is not whether the phenomena were genuine or fake. Perhaps what matters most is the question the case forces us to confront. What happens to emotional distress, to anger and confusion and pain, when it has nowhere to go? In young people especially, in adolescents whose brains are still developing, and whose emotions can feel overwhelming and uncontrollable, could that energy somehow manifest in the physical world? It is a question that sits at the intersection of psychology and physics, of mind and matter, of the known and the utterly mysterious. The law office of Sigmund Adam sat on a quiet street in Rosenheim, a modest Bavarian town, where the extraordinary should never have happened. Yet in the summer of 1967, the ordinary rhythms of legal paperwork and client consultations gave way to something that would challenge the foundations of scientific understanding. Light fixtures began to swing without wind, electrical bulbs exploded without cause, and the measured world of German bureaucracy found itself confronting the impossible. Annemarie Scharble was 19 years old when she accepted her position as secretary in the Adam Law Office. Quiet and unremarkable in appearance, she arrived each morning prepared for the routine tasks of typing correspondence, filing documents, and managing telephone calls. Nothing in her background suggested she would become the focal point of one of the most thoroughly documented cases of unexplained phenomena in modern history. Yet within weeks of her employment, the office itself seemed to rebel against the laws of physics. It began with the lights. Attorneys and staff members noticed the ceiling fixtures swaying, gentle at first, then with increasing violence. These were heavy fluorescent installations, firmly anchored to solid concrete ceilings. There was no vibration from street traffic, no tremors from construction. The building stood stable while the lights danced overhead. Then came the bulbs themselves, exploding in cascades of glass, with sharp reports that sent staff ducking for cover. The electrical disturbances escalated with disturbing regularity, and Sigmund Adam, a man trained in evidence and rational argument, found his professional environment descending into chaos he could not explain. Adam did what any skeptical professional would do. He called electricians. Teams of specialists examined every wire, every junction box, every connection in the building. They found the electrical system in perfect working order. They installed new fixtures, replaced circuits, and grounded everything that could be grounded. The phenomena continued, indifferent to their interventions. The telephone system became another source of bewilderment. The office bill showed hundreds of calls placed to the speaking clock, the automated time service known in Germany as Zeitzig. The office staff watched in confusion as call after call was registered to this number. Dozens in a single hour, yet no one was dialing. Secretaries working at their desks heard their phones click and connect, watched the dial mechanisms, and saw no human hand touching them. The calls placed themselves, racking up charges while the office watched helplessly. Then the physical manifestations grew more dramatic. Filing cabinet drawers slid open with deliberate smoothness, no hands pulling them. Papers inside remained undisturbed, as if invisible fingers had carefully opened each drawer without disturbing its contents. Pictures hung on walls for years suddenly rotated, turning precisely on their hooks until they hung askew or completely inverted. Staff members would straighten them, only to turn around and find them rotated again, as if some unseen presence delighted in the disturbance. By October of 1967, the situation had deteriorated to the point where normal business operations were nearly impossible. Sigmund Adam, desperate for answers, contacted authorities who could bring scientific rigor to the investigation. What happened next transformed a local mystery into a case that would be studied for decades. Professor Hans Bender arrived from the University of Freiburg, bringing with him a reputation as one of Europe's most respected researchers in parapsychology. Unlike the charlatans and sensationalists who often populated this field, Bender approached anomalous phenomena with scientific methodology and healthy skepticism. He had debunked numerous supposed hauntings and exposed fraudulent mediums. When Bender investigated, he brought instruments, not assumptions. Joining Bender were physicists from the Max Planck Institute and electrical engineers from the local utility company. These were not believers seeking confirmation of supernatural theories. They were skeptics armed with oscilloscopes, voltage meters, and monitoring equipment sophisticated enough to detect the smallest electrical irregularity. They came to find the rational explanation that surely must exist. What they documented instead defied their expectations. The team installed continuous monitoring equipment throughout the office, recording every fluctuation in the electrical system. The instruments captured power surges of significant magnitude, spikes in electrical current that had no corresponding external source. The utility company confirmed that the power supply from the grid remained stable and constant. The surges originated within the building itself, yet no equipment inside could account for them. The engineers documented voltage deflections that occurred without any switching operations, without any load changes, and without any identifiable cause within the electrical system. In their technical report, they used careful language to describe something that shouldn't exist: unexplained energy phenomena not consistent with known electrical principles. These were professionals whose careers were built on understanding exactly how electricity behaved. They were witnessing it behave in ways that contradicted fundamental physics. The investigation turned its attention to potential fraud. Could someone be manipulating the environment, creating these effects through hidden mechanisms? The team installed film cameras running continuously, positioned to capture every angle of the office. They examined walls for hidden motors, checked for concealed wires, and analyzed whether pendulums or other devices could create the swinging motion of the light fixtures. They found nothing. The phenomena occurred under observation, with cameras rolling and witnesses watching from multiple vantage points. Structural engineers examined the building for instabilities that might cause vibrations or movement. Foundation was sound, the structure solid. Seismologists confirmed no earthquake activity. The building itself had no explanation to offer. A pattern emerged that the investigators could not ignore. The phenomena occurred most intensely when Anna-Mary Schaberl was present. When she approached certain areas of the office, the electrical disturbances intensified. When she left for lunch or stepped outside, the activity diminished or ceased entirely. This was not conclusive evidence of causation, but the correlation was undeniable and documented across dozens of incidents. The investigators explored whether Anna-Mary might be generating some form of electromagnetic field. They tested her for unusual electrical properties, measured the space around her for anomalous readings, and found nothing that distinguished her from any other person. Yet the pattern held with statistical significance that eliminated coincidence. What made the Rosenheim case extraordinary was not just the phenomena themselves, but the quality of the documentation. Professor Bender and his team produced detailed reports with timestamps, instrument readings, and witness statements from credible observers. These weren't anecdotes shared in dim light. They were measured, recorded facts attested to by engineers whose professional reputations depended on accuracy. Two physicists from the Munich Technical University, Dr. Friedbert Karger and Dr. Gerhard Zicke, spent extensive time in the office with their monitoring equipment. In their published analysis, they acknowledged the impossibility of what they had documented. Karger would later state that the phenomena violated fundamental laws of physics, yet occurred under conditions that ruled out conventional explanation. For scientists trained in empirical methodology, this admission was significant. They were not claiming to understand what was happening. They were stating that what they observed should not be possible according to established scientific principles. The strain on Anna-Mary herself became evident. She was a young woman suddenly at the center of intense scrutiny, her every movement observed and recorded. Psychiatrists evaluated her, finding a shy individual under considerable stress, but exhibiting no signs of mental illness or deception. Some investigators noted she seemed as frightened by the phenomena as anyone else in the office. The theory that emerged, though it explained nothing mechanistically, was that Anna-Mary somehow served as a catalyst for what researchers termed recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. The phrase was merely descriptive, not explanatory. It acknowledged that physical objects moved in her presence through no known mechanism. It gave a name to the pattern without illuminating the cause. By December of 1967, the situation had become untenable. The office could not function with equipment failing, phones making phantom calls, and furniture moving independently. Sigmund Adam, despite his initial reluctance, had no choice but to accept that Anna-Mary's employment was incompatible with normal business operations. The decision was not made lightly, and by all accounts, it was not made with accusations of fraud or blame. The phenomena simply made her continued presence impossible. Anna-Mary left her position at the law office in early 1968. The electrical disturbances ceased immediately. The light fixtures hung motionless. The phones behaved normally. The pictures remained level on the walls. The office returned to the unremarkable routine of legal practice, as if the preceding months had been some collective fever dream, except for the thick folders of documentation proving otherwise. The Rosenheim case remained in scientific literature as one of the most rigorously investigated instances of apparent psychokinetic phenomena. The credibility of the investigators, the quality of their instrumentation, and the thoroughness of their documentation set it apart from the countless unverified ghost stories and supernatural claims that populate folklore. Professor Bender's team had approached the case prepared to debunk it. Instead, they produced evidence that they themselves could not reconcile with known physics. What happened to Anne Marie after she left the law office added an epilogue to the case. She found new employment, and reportedly, some minor disturbances occurred at her next workplace as well, though far less dramatic than those in Rosenheim. These eventually subsided. She married, lived a quiet life away from the attention the case had brought, and declined most requests for interviews in later years. For her, the phenomena had been a burden she neither sought nor understood. The Rosenheim case forces confrontation with uncomfortable questions. If fraud could not account for the documented phenomena, and if structural, electrical, and electromagnetic explanations were systematically eliminated by qualified experts, what remains? The human mind recoils from accepting that physical laws might be suspended or violated. Yet, the alternative requires dismissing the testimony and measurements of credentialed scientists whose professional integrity depended on accuracy and skepticism. Perhaps the deepest unsettling aspect is the human-centered nature of the phenomena. Machines malfunction. Buildings settle. Electrical systems develop faults. These are comprehensible failures. But the idea that a person, through no conscious effort or intent, might somehow alter physical reality in measurable ways strikes at our understanding of the boundary between mind and matter. It suggests we are not merely observers of the physical world, but potentially, in ways we do not understand, participants in shaping it. The Rosenheim case endures in the literature of the unexplained, not because it provides answers, but because it poses questions that remain unresolved. The documentation prevents easy dismissal. The credibility of the investigators demands serious consideration. And the pattern of phenomena ceasing when the apparent catalyst departed reinforces the disturbing possibility that some individuals, for reasons unknown, may occasionally serve as focal points for events that defy conventional explanation. In a law office in Bavaria, for several months in 1967, the impossible was measured, recorded, and witnessed by people trained to trust only evidence. What that evidence means continues to challenge us. In the winter of 1716, at Epworth Rectory in Lincolnshire, the Reverend Samuel Wesley and his family began to hear sounds that would haunt them for months. Knockings on the walls, footsteps pacing the hallways, the distinctive sound of something like a goblet being smashed against the wooden floors. What made this case particularly noteworthy wasn't just the phenomena itself, but who seemed to be at the center of it. The Wesley daughters, particularly 19-year-old Hetty, appeared to draw the disturbances like a magnet draws iron filings. When Hetty entered a room, the knockings intensified. When she lay in her bed at night, unseen hands seemed to lift the sheets. The family called the presence old Jeffrey, treating it almost as an unwelcome guest, but they couldn't ignore the pattern. The haunting had begun shortly after Hetty had reached adolescence, and it seemed to follow her emotional state with unsettling precision. This wouldn't be the last time such a pattern emerged. Throughout the centuries that followed, case after case revealed the same disturbing connection. At the center of violent poltergeist activity, investigators found not elderly homeowners or middle-aged families, but children. Specifically, adolescents on the cusp of adulthood. Even more specifically, young women navigating the turbulent waters of puberty, their bodies transforming, their minds caught between childhood and something they didn't yet understand. The Cock Lane ghost of 1762 in London centered around 11-year-old Elizabeth Parsons. The Rochester rappings of 1848 that launched the modern spiritualist movement revolved around the teenage Fox sisters, Kate and Margaret, aged 11 and 14. The Borley Rectory haunting in the 1930s intensified around the presence of the young maid, Adelaide. The Enfield Poltergeist of 1977 focused primarily on 11-year-old Janet Hodgson and her 13-year-old sister, Margaret Dutt. The pattern repeated so consistently that it became impossible for serious researchers to ignore. In 1958, parapsychologist William Roll began investigating these cases with fresh eyes. Rather than focusing on the ghosts themselves, Roll turned his attention to the living people at the center of the storm. What he found disturbed him more than any supernatural explanation might have. These weren't just random children. They were young people living under extraordinary psychological pressure. Victims of abuse, both physical and sexual. Children trapped in homes torn apart by divorce, alcoholism, domestic violence. Teenagers suppressing volcanic rage they had no safe way to express. Young women experiencing the confusing onset of sexuality in environments that punished or shamed such developments. Roll developed what he called recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis theory, or RSPK. The hypothesis proposed that these young people, unable to express their trauma, anger, and confusion through normal channels, were somehow unconsciously manifesting it as physical phenomena. The mind, pushed beyond its limits, was reaching out into the physical world and moving it. Not through conscious will, but through something deeper and more primal. The repressed rage of an abused child became flying objects. The sexual confusion of a pubescent girl became aggressive, almost sexual attacks by invisible forces. The helplessness of a teenager trapped in an unstable home became the chaos of a poltergeist infestation. The evidence Roll compiled was compelling in its darkness. In case after case, when he dug into the psychological profile of the young person at the center, he found trauma. The Seaford poltergeist of 1958 centered on 12-year-old James Herman, a boy who appeared well-adjusted on the surface, but who was suppressing intense anxiety about his parents' troubled marriage. The Columbus, Ohio case of 1984 focused on 14-year-old Tina Resch, an adopted girl who had experienced severe emotional neglect and was struggling with questions of identity and belonging. Investigators noted that objects seemed to fly toward her, or away from her, in patterns that matched her emotional state. When she was angry, things broke. When she was sad, things fell. But the most disturbing cases were those involving young women who had experienced sexual trauma. In these instances, the phenomena took on explicitly sexual characteristics. Invisible hands that touched and groped, bed sheets pulled away in the night, objects penetrating or attempting to penetrate. The language of the haunting seemed to mirror the language of the abuse, as if the unconscious mind was replaying the trauma in supernatural form. In the case of Carla Morin in 1974, later fictionalized in the film The Entity, the attacks were so violent and sexual in nature that investigators struggled to maintain professional objectivity. Carla had a history of childhood sexual abuse. Could her mind be creating the very thing it feared most, trapped in a cycle of psychological reenactment? The theory presents an almost unbearably uncomfortable question. If these young people are unconsciously creating the phenomena, are they perpetrators? Can we hold them responsible for violence their conscious minds don't intend and can't control? Or are they victims twice over, first of the trauma that damaged them, and second of a power they never asked for and can't understand? Consider the position of someone like Janet Hodgson at Enfield. Investigators documented furniture moving across rooms when she was present. Her voice changed, becoming deep and masculine, claiming to be the spirit of a deceased man who had lived in the house. Objects flew through the air. She and her sister were allegedly levitated from their beds. If we accept the RSPK theory, Janet's unconscious mind was doing all of this. But Janet was 11 years old. She had recently lost her father to divorce. She was entering puberty in a house filled with tension and economic hardship. Can we call a traumatized child a perpetrator of fraud when she might not even know what her own mind is capable of? The psychological profiles grow even darker when we examine the family dynamics surrounding these cases. Frequently, the young person at the center is not just experiencing internal turmoil, but external exploitation. Parents who use the haunting to gain attention or money. Investigators who push children to perform phenomena on command. Media circuses that turn traumatized teenagers into public spectacles. The Enfield case became a media sensation, with journalists camping outside the Hodgson home, demanding to witness the phenomena. Tina Resch was subjected to endless testing, cameras documenting her every move, researchers treating her as a laboratory specimen rather than a hurting child. Some researchers have proposed that even if the RSPK theory is partially correct, it doesn't explain everything. The phenomena in many cases display knowledge the young person couldn't possibly possess. Historical details about previous occupants of homes. Languages the children never learn. In the Enfield case, the voice claiming to be Bill Wilkins provided details about his life and death that were later verified. If Janet's unconscious mind was creating the voice, how did it access that information? This opens the door to a far more sinister possibility. What if the RSPK theory and supernatural explanation aren't mutually exclusive? What if these traumatized, energetically volatile young people are creating a psychic beacon that attracts something external? The trauma opens a door, the emotional energy provides a power source, and something else walks through. The young person becomes both victim and vessel, their pain exploited by forces that feed on suffering. This exploitation theory suggests that whatever entities might exist beyond our normal perception are opportunistic predators. They seek out the vulnerable, the damaged, the energetically unstable. A young girl going through puberty, already experiencing the natural upheaval of hormonal changes, who is also dealing with abuse or neglect, becomes the perfect target. Her reality is already fractured. The boundaries of her sense of self are already weakened. An external force can slip in through those cracks and use her energy to manifest in the physical world. The evidence for this darker interpretation comes from the behavior of the phenomena itself. In many cases, the activity seems designed not just to express the young person's trauma, but to deepen it. The phenomena frightens them, isolates them, makes them question their sanity. In the case of the Smurl family haunting in Pennsylvania during the 1980s, the activity focused on the teenage daughters, but seemed intent on psychologically destroying them. Attacks escalated from simple knockings to violent physical assaults to sexual violations. If the girls' unconscious minds were creating this, why would they create something so intent on their own destruction? Critics of both the RSPK theory and the exploitation theory point out that we're building elaborate structures on a foundation that may not exist. Skeptics argue that nearly every documented poltergeist case can be explained through a combination of fraud, misperception, and natural phenomena. They note that the presence of teenagers doesn't prove psychic ability, but rather proves that teenagers are creative, attention-seeking, and skilled at deception. The Enfield case, they point out, included multiple instances where Janet was caught faking phenomena. Tina Resch was filmed on surveillance camera, throwing objects herself. But even the exposure of fraud doesn't fully resolve the mystery. In many cases, while some phenomena were clearly faked, other incidents remained unexplained. Investigators in the Enfield case documented events that occurred when Janet was under observation and couldn't have produced the effects through normal means. This creates a third uncomfortable possibility, that traumatized young people might engage in a mix of genuine unconscious psychokinesis and conscious fraud, unable themselves to distinguish between what their minds are doing and what their hands are doing. The pattern persists into modern times. Contemporary cases continue to center on adolescents, particularly those undergoing psychological stress. A case in Georgia in 2008 focused on a 14-year-old girl whose foster home became the site of violent phenomena shortly after she arrived. Investigators discovered she had been removed from her biological home due to severe abuse. A case in Scotland in 2012 centered on twin sisters going through puberty, whose bedroom became a vortex of activity after their father's sudden death. What we're left with is a web of possibilities, none of them comfortable. Either these young people possess an ability that manifests through trauma, making them unwilling creators of chaos, or they are targeted by external forces that exploit their vulnerability, making them victims of predation from beyond. Or they are caught between both realities, their pain creating the energy, while something else provides the intelligence and malice. Or perhaps we are the exploiters, projecting our fascination with the supernatural onto damaged children who simply need help. The question that haunts researchers is this: when we investigate these cases, are we helping these young people, or are we feeding the very forces that torment them? Our attention, our fascination, our need to document and prove might provide exactly the energy that allows the phenomena to continue. We turn traumatized children into specimens, their pain into data, their horror into entertainment. In doing so, we might become part of the pattern ourselves, adults exploiting the suffering of the young for our own purposes. whether those purposes are scientific, financial, or simply the thrill of touching something beyond our understanding. The Epworth haunting ended when Hetty Wesley married and left home. The phenomena simply stopped. Was old Jeffrey a ghost that had been drawn to her energy, or was it her own unconscious power manifesting her desire to escape? We'll never know. But the pattern she established continues, generation after generation, young people caught between worlds, their trauma becoming theater, their pain becoming proof of something we can't quite name, but can't stop seeking. The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong in the Pritchett home came not with a scream or a crash, but with water. Puddles of it, inexplicable and impossible, spreading across the kitchen floor of 30 East Drive in Pontefract, England. It was late August of 1966 when Jean Pritchett returned home to find her kitchen transformed into something from a waking nightmare. The linoleum floor was covered in shallow pools of water that had no source, no broken pipe, no overflowing sink to explain their presence. She mopped them up, convinced there must be a rational explanation, some leak she simply couldn't identify. But the next day, the water returned, and with it came something far stranger. Green foam began oozing from the kitchen taps, thick and viscous, unlike anything that should emerge from the municipal water supply. It bubbled forth with an organic quality that made Jean's skin crawl, as if the house itself was somehow sick, expelling some toxic substance through its plumbing. Her husband Joe inspected the pipes, searching for contamination or chemical reaction that might explain the phenomenon. He found nothing. Their daughter Diane, 15 years old and home for the summer holiday, watched her parents grow increasingly unsettled. The house on East Drive had been their home for years, a modest semi-detached dwelling in a working-class neighborhood where nothing unusual ever happened. Until now. The Pritchett family tried to dismiss these early incidents as peculiar plumbing problems, strange coincidences that would resolve themselves. But the house had other plans. Objects began to move on their own. Small items at first, keys and coins that would vanish from tables only to reappear in impossible locations. Kitchen utensils were found scattered across floors in the morning, though no one had entered the room during the night. Furniture shifted positions. Doors that had been firmly closed would be found standing open, their handles turned by invisible hands. Philip, Diane's younger brother, was the first to witness something that shattered any possibility of rational explanation. He was alone in the living room when he saw it, a fine white powder falling from the ceiling like snow. Not dust, not plaster, but something finer, almost crystalline, drifting down through still air in defiance of any natural cause. He called for his mother, but by the time Jean arrived, the powder had vanished, leaving no trace on the furniture or carpet. No evidence except the terror in her son's eyes. The phenomena escalated with shocking speed. By September, the invisible presence in the house had begun to make noise. Loud, aggressive banging echoed through the walls at all hours. The sounds had a deliberate quality, responding to the family's movements, following them from room to room. When Joe shouted for it to stop, the banging would intensify, as if whatever haunted 30 East Drive was not only aware of the family, but actively antagonizing them. Neighbors on both sides of the semi-detached home heard nothing, their shared walls somehow impervious to sounds that rattled the Pritchett family's nerves and shook their faith in the physical world. Then came the night that changed everything. Diane was alone in her bedroom, preparing for sleep when she felt hands grip her ankles. Not the brush of something imagined, not the half-felt touch of a dream, but solid, physical hands with strength and intent. Before she could scream, she was dragged from her bed. Her body scraped across the floor, pulled by an invisible force toward the doorway. She clawed at the carpet, grasping for anything to stop her movement, but the grip was too strong. Her screams brought her parents running, and they witnessed something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Their daughter, suspended horizontally in the air, was being dragged up the stairs by nothing they could see. Joe lunged forward, grabbing Diane's arms, trying to pull her back down. It became a tug of war between a father and an invisible attacker, with his daughter's body as the rope. The force pulling her upward was immense, stronger than any human grip. Jean, her husband, both of them hauling on their daughter's arms while unseen hands clutched her legs. For several terrifying seconds, Diane hung suspended between floors, stretched between the world she could see and the one assaulting her. Then, suddenly, The grip released. She tumbled down the stairs into her parents' arms, sobbing and trembling, her pajamas torn, her skin already beginning to bruise. The physical assaults on Diane became a horrifying pattern. Slaps would materialize on her face, the sharp crack of palm against cheek echoing through rooms, her head snapping to the side from impacts delivered by empty air. Red handprints would bloom on her skin, perfect impressions of fingers and palms, visible evidence that something was touching her, hurting her, targeting her specifically. The marks were too clear to dismiss, too precise to be self-inflicted. Doctors who examined them found no medical explanation. The family photographed the marks, documenting the impossible, gathering evidence that something malevolent had invaded their home and chosen their daughter as its primary victim. Other family members were not spared. Joe was pushed down the stairs by unseen hands, tumbling head over heels, saved from serious injury only by his quick reflexes and strong build. Jean felt invisible fingers wrap around her throat, choking her in her own kitchen, while her family watched in helpless horror. Philip was thrown from his bed repeatedly, his small body tossed like a doll by forces he couldn't fight or understand. The entire family bore the bruises, the scratches, the marks of an entity that could touch them but could not be touched in return. And then they saw it. The thing that had been tormenting them finally revealed itself, taking form in a way that transformed their haunting from invisible terror into visible nightmare. It appeared first to Diane, materializing at the foot of her bed in the dead of night. A figure in black robes, hooded and monastic, its face hidden in shadow so complete that no features could be discerned. The figure stood motionless, radiating a presence of such malevolence that Diane felt her blood turn cold. She couldn't move, couldn't scream, paralyzed by the sight of something that should not exist standing solid and real in her bedroom. The Black Monk, as the family would come to call it, remained for several long moments before fading away, not walking or disappearing suddenly, but simply becoming less solid, less there, until only darkness remained. The apparition appeared to other family members over the following weeks. Jean saw it on the stairs, its hooded head turned toward her as she climbed to the second floor. Joe encountered it in the hallway, the robed figure blocking his path, forcing him to push through the space it occupied, passing through a cold so intense it felt like being submerged in ice water. Philip saw it standing outside his bedroom window, impossibly suspended at second-floor height, its faceless hood pressed against the glass. And incredibly, witnesses outside the family confirmed the sightings. Neighbors visiting the house encountered the Black Monk, their testimony adding credibility to what might otherwise have been dismissed as family hysteria. The most compelling evidence came from photographs. Multiple images captured during the height of the haunting showed anomalies that defied easy explanation. Dark shapes that resembled a hooded figure appeared in rooms where no such person had been standing. Light bent strangely around certain areas of the house. In one particularly disturbing photograph, a shadow cast on the wall clearly showed the silhouette of a monk's hood and robes, though nothing visible in the room could have created such a shadow. The images were examined by photographers and skeptics, analyzed for signs of double exposure or manipulation, but the technology of 1967 made such sophisticated hoaxing nearly impossible for a working-class family with no expertise in photography. The Pritchett family sought help from every quarter. They contacted the local church, desperate for spiritual intervention. A priest visited the house, performing prayers and blessings intended to cleanse the property of evil influence. The phenomena stopped for exactly 3 days. Then, as if enraged by the attempted exorcism, the haunting returned with renewed violence. Objects flew through the air with dangerous speed. Furniture overturned on its own. The temperature in certain rooms would plummet without warning, breath misting in the air even as adjacent rooms remained warm. The Black Monk appeared more frequently, sometimes multiple times in a single day, its manifestations growing longer and more solid. A more elaborate exorcism was arranged, involving prayers and rituals meant to cast out demonic forces. The priest moved through the house room by room, sprinkling holy water, reading scripture, commanding any evil presence to depart in the name of God. For a few weeks, peace returned to 30 East Drive. The family dared to hope that their nightmare had ended, that religious authority had succeeded where parental protection had failed. But the reprieve was temporary. The haunting returned, and with it came a sense that whatever haunted the house was beyond the reach of simple religious intervention, that it was older and more deeply rooted than prayers could dislodge. Research into the history of Pontefract revealed a darkness that seemed to echo in the present. The town's name itself derived from the Latin for broken bridge, but locals knew it by another designation. Pontefract had been called Pontus Fractus in medieval times, but also bore the grimmer nickname of Pomfret, under which name it had been known as a place of execution. The property at 30 East Drive sat near land that had once been part of a Cluniac monastery, established in the 11th century. The monastery had been a significant religious institution, home to dozens of monks who lived according to strict Benedictine rules. But like all human institutions, it had harbored darkness alongside devotion. Local legends spoke of a monk who had committed the most grievous of sins. According to stories passed down through centuries, this monk had raped and murdered a young girl, a crime so heinous that even the church's usual protection of its own could not save him. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death by hanging. The execution took place on the grounds that would later become part of the neighborhood where the Pritchett family lived. Some versions of the legend claimed the monk was hanged from a gallows erected specifically for his punishment, a public display meant to show that even holy men would face justice for unholy acts. Other versions suggested he was hanged from a tree, his body left to twist in the wind as a warning. The monastery itself had been destroyed during the dissolution under King Henry VIII in the 1530s. The buildings were torn down, the monks dispersed, the land redistributed. But the gallows had stood on that ground for years after, serving the town's judicial needs, becoming a place where death was administered in the name of the law. Multiple executions took place there, bodies swinging from ropes, souls departing to whatever judgment awaited them. By the time houses were built on the land in the 20th century, centuries had passed since the last execution. The ground had been blessed, built upon, transformed into ordinary residential streets where ordinary families lived ordinary lives. Except that some ground, perhaps, never forgets what transpired upon it. The connection between the Black Monk and the executed monk seemed almost too convenient, too much like a story crafted to explain inexplicable events. Yet the specificity of the haunting suggested something more than random supernatural activity. The figure wore monastic robes from a specific period. Its appearances seemed tied to the house's location rather than to any particular object or person, as if something was bound to that ground rather than following the family. And the violence of the phenomena echoed the violence of the crimes and punishment that had occurred centuries before. The haunting continued in cycles, periods of intense activity followed by weeks or months of relative calm. The pattern tormented the family with false hope. Each quiet period suggested the nightmare might finally be over, allowing them to begin recovering from their trauma. Then the phenomena would return, sometimes worse than before, plunging them back into terror. Diane bore the brunt of the attacks, her teenage years marked not by normal adolescent concerns but by bruises, handprints, and the memory of being dragged by invisible hands. The psychological toll was immense. She struggled to sleep, afraid of what might happen in the darkness. She avoided being alone in the house, terrified of encountering the Black Monk without witnesses who might protect her, or at least validate that what she was experiencing was real. The family considered moving, abandoning 30 East Drive to whatever haunted it. But working-class families in 1960s, England didn't have the financial flexibility to simply relocate. Their home represented years of mortgage payments, their primary investment, possibly the only property they would ever own. To leave would mean financial ruin, homelessness, or at best, a return to renting accommodation they could barely afford. They felt trapped, prisoners in their own home, held hostage by both a malevolent presence and economic reality. The case attracted attention from paranormal investigators, researchers who documented the phenomena and added the Pontefract haunting to the growing catalog of well-witnessed supernatural events. The presence of multiple witnesses, photographic evidence, and physical marks on victims made it difficult to dismiss as hallucination or fabrication. Skeptics proposed various theories, from mass hysteria to deliberate hoax to misidentified natural phenomena. But none of the proposed explanations adequately accounted for all the documented events, especially the physical assaults witnessed by people outside the immediate family. The haunting of 30 East Drive eventually subsided, though though it never completely ended. Even decades later, occasional phenomena would manifest in the house, as if whatever presence resided there merely slept between periods of activity. The Pritchett family eventually moved away, carrying with them psychological scars that would never fully heal. Diane, in particular, struggled with the aftermath. Her memories of those years a mixture of genuine trauma and almost surreal horror that seemed impossible even to those who had lived through it. The house itself became something of a dark landmark, known throughout England as the site of one of the most violent and well-documented poltergeist cases in European history. Subsequent residents reported varying degrees of activity, some experiencing intense phenomena while others lived there peacefully. The inconsistency only deepened the mystery, suggesting that whatever haunted 30 East Drive was selective about when and to whom it revealed itself. The Black Monk of Pontefract remains one of the most compelling cases for those who believe that some events transcend natural explanation, that history can leave scars on places as surely as on people, and that the past sometimes refuses to remain past. The children's bedroom on Green Street in Enfield, North London, looked like any other in 1977. Posters on the walls, toys scattered across the floor. Two sisters, 11-year-old Janet and 10-year-old Margaret, sharing whispered secrets in the dark. But on the night of August 31st, something happened that would transform this ordinary council house into the most documented paranormal case in British history. Margaret woke first, hearing a shuffling sound she couldn't identify. Then her bed began to shake. Not gently, not like someone bumping into the frame, but with violent, rhythmic force. She called out to Janet, who felt it too. The vibrations grew stronger. Their mother, Peggy Hodgson, a single parent raising 4 children alone, rushed into the room, switching on the light. The shaking stopped immediately. She checked the beds, looking for loose screws or broken slats. Everything seemed normal. She told the girls they must have been dreaming and went back to bed. But minutes later, the shuffling sound returned. This time, all 4 children heard it. A dragging, scraping noise, like heavy furniture being pushed across the floor. Peggy came back to find her daughters standing in the hallway, terrified. As they watched, the heavy chest of drawers in the girls' bedroom moved by itself, sliding away from the wall. Peggy pushed it back. It moved again. She pushed harder, using all her weight. The chest pushed back against her with a force she couldn't match. A divorced mother alone with her children, Peggy Hodgson ran next door and called the police. When Police Constable Carolyn Heaps arrived at 284 Green Street, she expected a domestic disturbance or perhaps frightened children letting their imaginations run wild. She did not expect what happened next. Standing in the Hodgson living room with her colleague, taking notes and trying to calm the family, she witnessed a chair slide 4 feet across the floor. No one touched it. No strings, no wires. Nothing she could see that might explain it. The chair simply moved. In her official police report, filed that night and later verified by multiple sources, Constable Heaps wrote that she saw the chair move of its own accord. A police officer, trained to observe and report facts, willing to put her name and reputation behind an impossible claim. The Enfield poltergeist had announced itself to the world, and it had done so in front of a credible witness wearing a uniform. The Daily Mirror heard about the police report and sent a photographer named Graham Morris to the house. He expected a quick assignment, maybe some shots of a messy room, and frightened children for a small story. Instead, he documented phenomena that would challenge everything he thought he knew about reality. Objects flew through the air while he watched through his camera lens. Marbles appeared from nowhere, raining down from the ceiling. He photographed toys moving on their own, furniture overturned, and most famously, a series of images that appeared to show Janet Hodgson suspended in mid-air above her bed. Not jumping, not leaping from one bed to another, but frozen horizontally in space, her body rigid, her face contorted, caught in the moment of levitation. Morris took over 600 photographs during his time at the house. He described hearing voices that came from nowhere, feeling sudden drops in temperature, and watching a grown man, a skeptical journalist, reduced to tears by what he witnessed. The Society for Psychical Research sent 2 investigators to Green Street. Maurice Gross, a businessman who had turned to paranormal research after the death of his daughter, seeking some proof that consciousness survived death. And Guy Lyon Playfair, an experienced researcher who had studied poltergeist cases in Brazil. Both men approached the case with cautious skepticism, aware that children could fake phenomena, that families sometimes sought attention or money. They set up recording equipment, cameras, and began a systematic documentation process that would span more than 2 years. What they recorded during that time remains some of the most disturbing evidence in paranormal research. The phenomena centered on Janet, the middle child, neither the oldest nor the youngest, a girl described by teachers as quiet and unremarkable. But something had chosen her, or she had somehow become a conduit for something that defied explanation. She began to levitate, witnesses claimed, rising from her bed in the middle of the night. Her brother Billy said he woke once to find her floating above him, her body horizontal, 3 feet off the ground. Maurice Gross set up cameras with tripwires, hoping to catch the moment on film. He captured images of Janet, apparently mid-flight, her body suspended between beds, her nightgown billowing around her. Skeptics argued she was simply jumping, that the photographs showed nothing more than a child leaping from bed to bed. But Gross pointed to the distances involved, the angles of her body, the consistent reports from multiple witnesses who swore they saw her rise into the air without jumping, without any visible means of propulsion. Then the voice began. Deep, masculine, gravelly, utterly unlike the voice of an 11-year-old girl. It claimed to be Bill Wilkins, a man who had died in the house years before. Gross verified the story. A man named Bill Wilkins had indeed lived at 284 Green Street. He had died sitting in a chair in the living room, in the exact corner where the most violent poltergeist activity occurred. The voice provided details about Wilkins' life that Janet, a child who had moved to the house after his death, should not have known. It described the layout of the house before renovations. It mentioned family members by name. It spoke for hours, recorded on tape, analyzed by voice specialists, who confirmed that the sound was coming from Janet's mouth, but that the vocal mechanism producing it was inconsistent with normal speech. The voice seemed to originate from her throat, in a way that should have damaged her vocal cords, producing a rough, gasping quality that sounded like a dying man struggling to breathe. The BBC sent a team to investigate. Reporter Rosalind Morris spent several days in the house, hoping to expose a hoax. Instead, she became a believer. She recorded her experiences, describing objects flying past her head, doors slamming with no one near them, and Janet speaking in the voice of Bill Wilkins while apparently unconscious. Morris brought in additional camera crews, sound technicians, and journalists, all of whom witnessed phenomena they couldn't explain. The BBC footage shows curtains billowing in rooms with closed windows, toys moving across the floor, and Janet in various states of apparent possession, her face distorted, her body contorted, that impossible voice rasping from her throat. But there were problems with the case. Janet was caught faking phenomena, multiple times. Gross found her bending spoons manually. A video camera, hidden in the room, captured her bouncing on the bed and throwing objects when she thought no one was watching. She admitted to investigators that she sometimes faked activity because the real phenomena had stopped, and she didn't want the attention to end. Skeptics seized on these admissions as proof that the entire case was a hoax. A child had fooled gullible adults, they argued. The photograph showed nothing but a girl jumping. The voice was simply Janet's talent for impersonation. Every piece of evidence could be explained by a clever child and wishful thinking. Yet the investigators remained convinced that something genuine had occurred, even if Janet had sometimes embellished it. Gross argued that the faked incidents represented perhaps 5% of the total phenomena. What about the other 95%? What about the events witnessed by police officers, BBC crews, neighbors, and dozens of other credible witnesses? What about the metal components that bent in front of multiple observers, the spoons and forks twisted into shapes that required force Janet simply did not possess? What about the recordings of the voice, analyzed by speech experts who found physiological anomalies they couldn't explain? What about the sheer volume of documented activity occurring over 2 years in front of more than 30 different witnesses? The phenomena grew more violent. Janet was thrown from her bed with enough force to leave bruises. She described feeling hands grabbing her, pushing her, choking her. The voice became threatening, telling the family to leave, cursing at investigators, making predictions about death and disaster. Objects flew through the air with increasing velocity. A heavy iron fireplace grate was ripped from the wall and hurled across the room. Kitchen drawers opened and closed by themselves, their contents scattered. Water appeared on floors and walls in rooms with no plumbing. The temperature in certain rooms would drop suddenly, breath visible in the air, then return to normal within seconds. The psychological toll on the family became severe. Peggy Hodgson, exhausted from months of disturbed sleep and constant chaos, began to break down. She couldn't work consistently. Friends and family stopped visiting, afraid or skeptical. The children struggled in school, marked as either liars or victims of something terrible. Janet bore the worst of it. She was the focus of the phenomena, the one who levitated, who spoke in voices not her own, who was grabbed and thrown by invisible hands. She underwent medical examinations, psychological evaluations, was studied and photographed and recorded, until she barely seemed like a child anymore, more like a specimen under glass. She told investigators she didn't know if the entity was real or if she was going insane. She couldn't tell anymore where her own thoughts ended and the voice began. Sometimes she would wake up in different rooms with no memory of moving. Sometimes hours would pass that she couldn't account for. She was 11 years old, then 12, then 13. Her adolescence consumed by something that refused to leave. Guy Lyon Playfair documented incidents where objects move, while Janet was visible to multiple witnesses, her hands clearly empty, her body nowhere near the object in question. A coat rack flew across a room while Janet stood 10 feet away, surrounded by observers. A radio turned itself on and off while she sat on a bed with both hands held by investigators. Marbles shot across the room from directions where no one stood. Playfair noted over 1,500 separate incidents in his records, categorizing them by type, number of witnesses, and potential for fraud. He concluded that while Janet had certainly faked some phenomena, a core of genuine poltergeist activity remained unexplained. The case attracted international attention. Researchers from America, Europe, and Asia requested permission to study the house and family. Some came away convinced of genuine paranormal activity. Others declared it an obvious hoax. The debate grew heated. Professional reputations were staked on positions for or against the Enfield case. Meanwhile, the Hodgson family remained trapped in their council house on Green Street, unable to afford to move, living with phenomena that seemed to feed on attention but never quite stopped even when ignored. The activity finally began to diminish in late 1979, more than 2 years after it began. The voice appeared less frequently. The levitations stopped. Objects still moved occasionally, but with less violence, less frequency. Janet entered her teenage years, and the phenomena faded like a fever breaking. By the time she was 14, the house had returned to something approaching normalcy. Maurice Grosse continued to visit periodically, documenting occasional incidents, but the peak of the haunting had passed. The Enfield poltergeist, whatever it was, had loosened its grip. Janet Hodgson, interviewed as an adult, stood by her story. Yes, she had faked some incidents, she admitted freely, but the core phenomena were real. She had levitated. The voice had spoken through her without her conscious control. Something had invaded her home and her body, and for 2 years she had lived as its primary victim and its channel into the physical world. She described the experience as a violation, an invasion that left psychological scars she carried into adulthood. Dozens of witnesses, many with no belief in the paranormal before their experiences at Green Street, confirmed her account. They had seen things that shouldn't be possible. They had documented them, photographed them, recorded them, and staked their professional credibility on the reality of what they witnessed. The skeptics remained unconvinced. They pointed to the instances of fraud, to the lack of phenomena when proper controls were in place, to the psychological profile of an attention-seeking child in a broken home. They argued that the whole case could be explained by a clever girl and gullible adults who wanted to believe. The believers countered with the weight of evidence, the number and quality of witnesses, the phenomena that occurred under controlled conditions in front of credible observers. The debate continues decades later, researchers still arguing over photographs and recordings, over witness testimony and physical evidence. The house at 284 Green Street stands unchanged, occupied now by other families. Some report strange occurrences. Others live there peacefully, experiencing nothing unusual. The Hodson family scattered, carrying their memories of those 2 years, divided even among themselves about what exactly happened. But the evidence remains. 600 photographs, hours of audio recordings, witness statements from police officers, journalists, researchers, and neighbors. The most documented poltergeist case in history, and perhaps the most controversial, a case that offers no easy answers, only questions that refuse to die. On the morning of January 19, 1967, Alvin Lobheim arrived at his warehouse in northwest Miami, expecting an ordinary Thursday. He unlocked the front door of Tropication Arts, the novelty and souvenir distribution company he'd built from nothing, and stepped into what would become one of the most documented and scrutinized cases of apparent poltergeist activity ever recorded in a commercial setting. What made this case extraordinary wasn't just the phenomena itself, but where it happened, who witnessed it, and the unprecedented level of scientific investigation that would follow. Tropication Arts occupied a modest single-story building on Northwest 54th Street. Inside, metal shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, stocked with the kinds of trinkets that filled tourist shops along Miami Beach. Plastic alligators, seashell ashtrays, novelty mugs, decorative glasses, ceramic figurines. Thousands of items packed into cardboard boxes, organized by product type, waiting to be shipped to retailers throughout South Florida. It was a practical space, utilitarian, filled with the mundane machinery of small business commerce. There was nothing Gothic about it, nothing that suggested the supernatural. No creaking Victorian mansion, no isolated farmhouse with a tragic history. Just fluorescent lights, concrete floors, and inventory. But on that January morning, something inexplicable began to happen. Lobheim was in the office area when he heard the first crash. He rushed into the warehouse section to find a box of merchandise lying in the center aisle, several feet from the nearest shelf. Glasses and novelty items were scattered across the concrete floor. His first thought was structural. Perhaps a shelf bracket had failed. But when he examined the metal shelving, everything was secure, properly installed, showing no signs of weakness or collapse. Before he could make sense of it, another box fell. Then, another. Lobheim stood perfectly still, watching in disbelief as a carton of souvenir mugs launched itself from a shelf at chest height and sailed through the air, landing 10 feet away with a tremendous crash. He was the only person in the warehouse. There was no one to throw it, no vibration he could feel, no reasonable explanation for what he was witnessing. Over the next several days, the phenomena escalated. Boxes didn't simply fall, they flew. Objects moved horizontally across rooms, defying gravity. Decorative beer mugs shot off shelves like projectiles. Glasses shattered against walls. A zinc-plated pail traveled across the warehouse floor, while multiple people watched, unable to explain its movement. Items that should have dropped straight down when dislodged instead arced through the air in parabolic trajectories, as if thrown by an invisible hand. What separated this case from typical poltergeist reports was the sheer number of witnesses. This wasn't a family experiencing strange events in private, where skeptics could dismiss testimony as collusion or delusion. This was a functioning business with employees, delivery drivers, customers, and eventually law enforcement officers, all of whom witnessed the phenomena directly. Lobheim's employees were terrified. Some refused to enter certain areas of the warehouse. Others threatened to quit entirely. Among the staff was a 19-year-old Cuban refugee named Julio Vasquez, who worked in shipping and receiving. Julio had come to America as part of the massive wave of Cuban immigration following Fidel Castro's revolution. He'd left behind everything he knew, arriving in Miami with little more than the clothes on his back and a fierce determination to build a new life. But Julio carried burdens that weren't visible on the surface. He'd experienced trauma that he rarely discussed. The displacement, the loss of home and family connections, the struggle to adapt to a new culture while working long hours for minimal pay. He was quiet, intense, often withdrawn. Co-workers noticed he seemed perpetually on edge, as though some internal pressure was constantly building with no outlet for release. As the warehouse phenomena continued, Lobheim began to notice a pattern. The incident seemed to cluster around Julio. When the young man was working in a particular area, that's where objects flew. When he moved to a different section, the activity followed. At first, Lobheim dismissed it as coincidence, but the correlation became impossible to ignore. The situation reached a breaking point when Lobheim contacted the Miami Police Department. Initially, the responding officers arrived expecting to find evidence of vandalism or perhaps an elaborate prank. What they encountered instead challenged everything they thought they understood about physical reality. Patrolman William Killen was one of the first officers on scene. A seasoned cop with years of street experience, Killen approached the call with professional skepticism. He'd seen con artists, attention seekers, and staged hoaxes. He knew how people could manipulate situations, create illusions, fake evidence. But what he witnessed at Tropication Arts didn't fit any framework he could explain. Killen watched as a box of merchandise fell from a shelf while Julio Vasquez was standing 15 feet away, in clear view, with his hands at his sides. The officer examined the shelving, looking for wires, magnets, any conceivable mechanism that could cause the movement. He found nothing. He watched Julio carefully, searching for any furtive motion, any opportunity for trickery. There was none. And yet, objects continued to move. More police officers arrived. They spread throughout the warehouse, positioning themselves to observe from multiple angles. They watched Julio continuously, several officers keeping him in sight simultaneously to ensure he couldn't physically cause the phenomena without being detected. Despite this intense scrutiny, items continued to fly off shelves. Beer mugs crashed to the floor. A carton sailed through the air and struck a wall. The police documented everything. They took statements, photographed damage, mapped where objects landed in relation to where they'd been stored. They questioned employees separately, looking for inconsistencies that might indicate conspiracy. They found none. Every witness described the same inexplicable events. Objects moving without apparent cause, trajectories that defied normal physics, phenomena that clustered around the young Cuban refugee. Word of the warehouse haunting spread quickly through Miami's scientific community. It reached William Roll, a parapsychologist working with the Psychical Research Foundation in Durham, North Carolina. Roll had spent years investigating claims of poltergeist activity, and he recognized that the Tropication Arts case offered something rare in his field: multiple credible witnesses, ongoing phenomena, and the possibility of controlled observation. Roll arrived in Miami within days, bringing with him the rigorous methodology of experimental psychology. He wasn't interested in ghost stories or supernatural explanations. He wanted data, measurements, reproducible observations. He wanted to understand what was actually happening, stripped of mysticism and assumption. Working with J. Guither Pratt, another experienced parapsychologist, Roll set up controlled experiments within the warehouse. They created detailed maps of the space, numbering every shelf, cataloging every item. They positioned observers at strategic locations. Most importantly, they kept Julio under constant observation, ensuring that he could not physically cause the phenomena through normal means. During one documented experiment, Roll and Pratt watched as a box moved off a shelf while Julio was at the opposite end of the warehouse, in clear view of multiple observers, with no opportunity to touch or manipulate anything. They measured the distance the object traveled. They photographed its position before and after. They noted the trajectory, the force of impact, the circumstances of movement. Roll conducted test after test, varying conditions, eliminating variables, searching for any conventional explanation. He considered vibration, air currents, structural instability, even the possibility of mass hallucination. Nothing fit the observed facts. Objects moved when they shouldn't. They traveled distances that simple falling couldn't explain. And always the phenomena correlated with Julio's presence. But Roll noticed something else, something that would prove crucial to understanding the case. The phenomena weren't random. They increased when Julio was under stress. They intensified when he was anxious or upset. They diminished when he was calm or absent from the warehouse. This suggested that whatever was happening wasn't external to Julio. It was somehow connected to his internal psychological state. Roll began extensive interviews with the young man, slowly building trust, encouraging him to discuss his background, his feelings, his struggles. What emerged was a portrait of profound internal conflict. Julio felt displaced, powerless, angry at circumstances beyond his control. He'd lost his homeland, his family connections, his sense of identity. He worked long hours in a warehouse, handling tourist trinkets, barely making enough to survive. He felt invisible, voiceless, trapped. Roll hypothesized that the poltergeist phenomena might represent an unconscious expression of this internal turmoil. Not ghosts or spirits, but rather a form of recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, where psychological distress somehow manifested as physical effects in the environment. It was a controversial theory, one that challenged both supernatural and purely materialist worldviews. Working with the warehouse owner, Roll arranged for Giulio to receive psychological counseling. The young man began meeting with a therapist, finally given a space to process his trauma, to articulate feelings he'd kept buried, to work through the displacement and loss that had defined his refugee experience. The results were remarkable. As Giulio began counseling, as he started to address his psychological distress through conventional therapeutic means, the warehouse phenomena decreased. Objects stopped flying. Boxes stayed on shelves. The crashes and unexplained movements that had plagued Tropication Arts for weeks simply ceased. By mid-February, barely a month after the phenomena began, the warehouse had returned to normal. No more flying objects, no more terrified employees, no more police reports documenting impossible events. Giulio continued his counseling and continued working at the warehouse without incident. Whatever force had animated those weeks of chaos had dissipated, as mysteriously as it had appeared. The Tropication Arts case remained unique in the annals of paranormal investigation. It offered something rarely found in such reports: multiple credible adult witnesses including law enforcement, controlled scientific observation, documented phenomena under test conditions, and no evidence of fraud, despite intense scrutiny from both police and researchers. The warehouse setting eliminated many of the criticisms leveled at household poltergeist cases, where family members might collude or where investigation was less rigorous. William Roll would continue to reference the Tropication Arts case throughout his career as one of the most evidential poltergeist investigations ever conducted. The correlation between Giulio's psychological state and the phenomena, and the cessation of activity when he received appropriate mental health support, suggested connections between mind and matter that mainstream science was ill-equipped to explain. Skeptics pointed to the lack of a clear mechanism. How could psychological distress cause objects to move? What energy source could power such effects? Without answers to these fundamental questions, they argued, the case proved nothing except the unreliability of eyewitness testimony, even when those eyewitnesses included police officers and trained scientists. But the witnesses knew what they'd seen. Alvin Lobheim, who'd built his business through practical hard work, who had no belief in the supernatural, had watched boxes fly across his warehouse. Police officers had documented phenomena they couldn't explain. William Roll, applying rigorous experimental controls, had observed objects moving under conditions that eliminated conventional explanation. The Tropication Arts case suggests that the boundaries between psychological and physical reality may be more permeable than we imagine. That the mind, under extreme duress, might interact with the material world in ways we don't yet understand. That the internal chaos of a traumatized refugee might somehow manifest as external chaos in his environment. What haunted that Miami warehouse in 1967 wasn't a ghost. It was something more complex, more human, more tragic. It was the invisible weight of displacement, the silent scream of powerlessness, the accumulated pressure of trauma seeking any outlet for expression. And when that pressure found release through conventional means, through therapy and human connection, the phenomena simply vanished. The warehouse still stands in northwest Miami, now occupied by different businesses, serving different purposes. The shelves that once launched their contents across the room now hold different inventory. The floors where glasses shattered and boxes crashed have been walked on by thousands of feet, carrying the ordinary traffic of commerce. Nothing unusual happens there anymore. The space has returned to being exactly what it appears to be, a practical building serving practical purposes. But for those who were there in early 1967, who witnessed the impossible made manifest, the Tropication Arts case remains an indelible memory. A reminder that reality sometimes exceeds our categories, that human consciousness might harbor capabilities we've barely begun to understand, and that the most profound hauntings may originate not from the dead, but from the troubled psyches of the living. After decades of investigation, after countless hours of analysis, after testimony from police officers and scientists, and terrified families, we return to the questions that started it all. Why do poltergeist phenomena cluster around specific individuals? Why do troubled adolescents so often find themselves at the epicenter of these disturbances? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what does the evidence really tell us about the nature of what we call the poltergeist? The recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis theory offers an elegant explanation. It suggests that the human mind, under extreme stress, can unconsciously affect the physical world. The correlation is undeniable. In the Enfield case, 11-year-old Janet Hodgson was at the center of 18 months of activity. In Columbus, 14-year-old Tina Resch became the focal point of objects flying across rooms. The Rosenheim poltergeist revolved around 19-year-old secretary Anne-Marie Chabrol. Time and again, we find adolescents experiencing puberty, family trauma, or psychological turmoil at the heart of these events. But the RSPK theory, compelling as it is, struggles to explain certain elements that persist across cases. How do we account for the voices that respond to questions with information the focal person couldn't possibly know? In Enfield, the entity calling itself Bill Wilkins provided details about the house's previous occupant that were later verified. In Mackenzie House in Toronto, the poltergeist knew intimate details about the building's history. These are not random psychic outbursts. They demonstrate knowledge, intention, and a disturbing form of intelligence. The most credible evidence resists simple categorization. Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair recorded over 200 hours of audio in Enfield, capturing knocking sounds that responded to questions in intelligent patterns, voices that emerged from young Janet's throat while her mouth appeared sealed, furniture moving while witnesses watched. The investigators, initially skeptical, came to believe they were dealing with something that could not be explained by teenage trickery alone. Police officers witnessed chairs sliding across floors. A BBC crew captured a Lego brick flying across a room on camera, traveling in a trajectory that defied the laws of motion. In the Rosenheim case, physicist Dr. Friedbert Karger and electrical engineer Gerhard Zicka installed monitoring equipment that recorded voltage fluctuations and unexplained power drains. Light bulbs unscrewed themselves from fixtures while engineers watched. Telephone bills showed calls being placed to the speaking clock at rates faster than humanly possible, sometimes multiple calls per second. The electrical company, after exhaustive investigation, could find no technical explanation. Dr. Karger, a respected scientist, stated publicly that the phenomena were genuine and could not be attributed to fraud or equipment malfunction. Photographs present their own category of evidence. The Enfield photographs, taken by professional photographers and journalists, show furniture in mid-air, children levitating above beds, objects frozen in flight. Critics have examined these images for decades, searching for wires, for trick photography, for any sign of manipulation. Some images have been debunked. Others remain unexplained. The photograph of Janet Hodgson appearing to float horizontally across her bedroom, taken by Graham Morris, has been subjected to extensive analysis. No evidence of tampering has been found, though skeptics argue the image could show a child jumping rather than levitating. The testimony of credible witnesses carries significant weight. These are not anonymous reports or secondhand stories. Police officers filed official reports describing phenomena they witnessed directly. Constable Carolyn Heaps visited the Hodgson home in Enfield and watched a chair slide across the floor with no apparent cause. Her testimony was given under oath. Dr. Bruce Taub, a psychologist who investigated the Columbus case, initially assumed he would expose teenage fraud. Instead, he observed objects moving when Tina Resch was not touching them, captured partially on video by a television news crew. His report described phenomena that challenged his understanding of what was possible. Scientists who have engaged seriously with poltergeist cases find themselves in uncomfortable territory. The phenomena resist controlled laboratory conditions. They are spontaneous, unpredictable, and seem to diminish under rigorous scrutiny, as if conscious of being observed. Yet the sheer volume of consistent reports from independent sources across different decades and continents creates a pattern that demands explanation. This brings us to a disturbing possibility that some researchers have begun to consider. What if both theories contain truth? What if psychological distress in vulnerable individuals creates not the phenomena itself, but rather an opening? What if extreme emotion, particularly the volatile emotional states of adolescence, tears a gap in whatever barrier normally separates us from other forms of consciousness or energy? The poltergeist might be both psychokinetic and external, both generated by and attracted to the troubled mind at its center. This dual theory would explain the consistent patterns. It would account for why adolescents under stress are so often involved, while also explaining the intelligence and historical knowledge displayed by some entity. The human mind becomes a doorway, and something else walks through. The emotional turmoil provides the energy, the vulnerability provides the access point, and what enters is something genuinely other. The implications are profoundly unsettling. It would mean that certain emotional and psychological states carry inherent risk beyond the mental health concerns we already recognize. It would suggest that our interior landscape connects to something exterior, that the boundary between self and world is more permeable than we assume. Every troubled teenager, every dysfunctional home charged with anger and fear, could potentially become a site of manifestation. And the phenomena continue. Poltergeist cases are reported worldwide with striking consistency. In Japan, they speak of tsukumogami, objects that gain sentient awareness. In Brazil, reports of psychokinetic disturbances cluster around troubled children with the same patterns seen in European and American cases. From South Africa to Singapore, from Mexico to Moscow, the details remain eerily similar. Adolescents report feeling watched. Objects move. Voices emerge. Witnesses describe the same progression from minor disturbances to violent outbursts to eventual cessation. Modern technology has not diminished these reports. Instead, it has increased documentation. Smartphones capture footage. Home security systems record disturbances. Social media spreads accounts with unprecedented speed. Yet even with everyone carrying a camera, definitive proof remains elusive. The phenomena seem to resist capture, to retreat from documentation, as if possessing an awareness of being recorded. The most haunting aspect is this: the conditions that might trigger poltergeist activity exist in countless homes at any given moment. Family dysfunction, adolescent turmoil, emotional suppression, and explosive conflict are tragically common. If the theories hold any truth, the next outbreak could emerge anywhere these elements converge. Your neighbor's home, your child's bedroom, the apartment above yours, where you hear furniture moving late at night. Consider this final thought as you move through your daily life. When you see movement in your peripheral vision and turn to find nothing there, when objects appear in places you're certain you didn't leave them, when you feel an inexplicable presence in an empty room, you face a question without a comfortable answer. Is your mind creating these experiences through some unconscious psychokinetic process, projecting internal turmoil into external space? Or is your emotional state opening a doorway, allowing something that exists independently to use your consciousness as a bridge into physical reality? The poltergeist remains unsolved not because we lack theories, but because the truth might be stranger and more troubling than any single explanation can contain. Somewhere tonight, in an ordinary house in an ordinary town, objects are beginning to move on their own. Someone is beginning to feel watched. And the question that has persisted for centuries remains unanswered. When the disturbances begin, what exactly is doing the disturbing? And Dar. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.